Applesauce is one of those dishes where the homemade version is a lot better than store-bought, and it's actually extremely simple to make at home. All you have to do is peel and cut your apples, let them simmer along with some sugar and optionally some spices, then just mash them up and you've got your applesauce. But if you're like me, you want to be sure that you're making it the best it can possibly be, and by changing the types of apples that you use, you can significantly change the flavor of your applesauce without any additional effort. So today I'm going to put it to the test by making several different applesauces with different types of apples, all of which should be readily available at your local grocery store to see which type makes the best applesauce. And before we start the experiment, let's quickly walk through the recipe that we'll be using. So I'm starting with 1 pound of apples, and in this case I'm using Granny Smith. But the 4 types of apples that we'll be using in this experiment are Granny Smith, Honeycrisp, Golden Delicious, and Fuji. But regardless of which type of apple you use, the process will be exactly the same. So first I'll just peel the apples, then cut them into small, about 1/2 inch cubes. Then I'll throw those into a heavy bottomed pot which is set over a medium to low heat, along with about 1/4 cup of water, a pinch of salt, and 1 tablespoon of light brown sugar. Now I also usually throw in about 1/8 to 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon at this point, but for the purpose of this experiment, I'm just going to keep it plain this time. So of course if you're making it at home, you can add cinnamon or any other spices that you like. Then we'll just cover the pot and let that simmer for 20 to 25 minutes, stirring about every 5 minutes and making sure that the mixture stays at just a light simmer. In my case, I actually let it go a bit too long without checking on it, so after 15 minutes it was already done. So you'll know it's done when the apples have broken down, but not completely, so you should still be left with some chunks. Then from there we'll just transfer into a separate bowl to finish mashing. So if you like a very smooth applesauce, the best way to do it would be to use an immersion blender, or to let the applesauce cool and throw it into a normal blender or a food processor. But personally I prefer my applesauce slightly more chunky, so I just use a potato masher to crush them up. And honestly, even if you don't have any type of blender, you can still get the applesauce pretty smooth as long as you've simmered the apples for long enough. So that's all there is to it. It really is very simple, and if you've never made your own applesauce, I'd highly recommend you give it a try because, as I mentioned, homemade applesauce is way better than store-bought. But anyways, with all that out of the way, it's time for me to make the rest of my applesauces, and I'll be back for the taste test. Alright, so I'm back with my finished applesauces, and I let these ones cool for about 2 hours in the refrigerator. So even though I do think homemade applesauce is pretty good warm, I would think most people are going to eat it cold, and just for the sake of consistency in this experiment, I decided to cool them all down. So like I mentioned, I chose apples that should be readily available in any grocery store. So I have Granny Smith, Honeycrisp, Golden Delicious, and Fuji. And then this applesauce is actually a hybrid between the Granny Smith and the Honeycrisp, because I've often seen recipes recommend making it that way, and that's the way that I've usually made it myself up until this point. Now before we taste each of the applesauces, I also wanted to do a quick taste test between each of the 4 types of apples that I use. Because of course different types of apples can taste vastly different, and I think it'll be interesting to see how they taste in their raw forms, and then compare that to how it translates into an applesauce. So we'll start with the Granny Smith here. And obviously everybody's probably had Granny Smith apples. It's gonna be very tart, a little bit sweet, but pretty intense in its flavor. So let's see how it is. Yeah, so pretty much as tart as it can get. I do like pretty acidic food, but even for me, I think that's a little bit much to eat just on its own. But it does tend to translate pretty well into cooked applications like apple pies, because cooking it tends to bring out that sweetness and kind of tame down the acidity. Now I'll try the Honeycrisp. For me, Honeycrisp is one of my favorite apples, especially when they're in season in the fall here in Michigan. So it's got a pretty nice balance between the sweetness and acidity. I still think for me it could be a little more acidic for my taste, but it's still a really great tasting apple, and it's got for me sort of just that signature apple flavor that I look for in a snacking apple. So now we'll move on to the Golden Delicious apple. So in this apple, the sweetness definitely dominates over the acidity. It's not a very tart apple, but it's definitely not bad tasting. It's almost sort of pear-like in its flavor, where it's not too intense, not too acidic, just pretty sweet and mellow, and overall it's a pretty good apple for snacking on. I don't think I've actually ever cooked with it, so I am interested to see how it translates into an applesauce. Now finally, let's try the Fuji apple. So that's definitely the worst tasting of the 4. I mean, there's really not much going on. I would say it's a little bit sweet, really no tartness at all that I could detect. And just the overall flavor was very bland, not very intense. And I think that even if it were just a version of this with a more intense flavor, it still wouldn't be my favorite. At that point, it would kind of just taste like a Golden Delicious, but with a little less acidity. So now with that out of the way, I think I have my ideas of what's gonna translate well into an applesauce, but let's do the official taste test. Alright, so we'll start again with the Granny Smith. Alright, so that's a pretty good applesauce. Definitely very tart, just like you would expect. And I think it could probably benefit from maybe adding some cinnamon or making it almost like a dessert version, mixing in some butter and more sugar. But definitely not bad. I would say in its current form though, it's probably a little bit too acidic even for me. So now let's try the Honeycrisp. So that one's actually pretty good as well, even though it's quite a different flavor profile from the Granny Smith version. It's definitely a lot sweeter, a lot less acidity, but since the flavor intensity of those Honeycrisps was pretty strong and they just tasted so good to begin with, that translates pretty well into the applesauce. Again, pretty sweet, and you really don't need to add any more sugar to it in order to make it taste good. So now let's try the half and half Granny Smith and Honeycrisp. So I had to go back and taste the Granny Smith just to compare, but just like I expected, this version is a great balance between these first two. It's basically a more tamed down version of the Granny Smith applesauce, but with those more appley, sweet flavors of the Honeycrisp. So again, this version is just half and half Granny Smith and Honeycrisp, but I could definitely see making different ratios. So if you like more acidity, you might go 75% Granny Smith and then 25% Honeycrisp, or you could reverse that if you like it more sweet. And again, for me, since I do like some level of acidity, I think this is my favorite of the three so far. And if I were to make it again, I probably would try the 75% Granny Smith, 25% Honeycrisp version, and I think that might be a pretty good fit for me. Alright, so now let's move on to the Golden Delicious. Alright, so that one's definitely not bad. I would say of the ones I've tried so far, it's most comparable to the Honeycrisp, but it's definitely less intense in its flavor, and I would say a bit less acidity as well. It does have some nice sweetness though, and I would say overall pretty well balanced. Personally, I would just like a little bit more of an intense flavor. I think this one's a little bit bland for my taste. But if you do like something a little bit more mild tasting, I definitely don't think you could go wrong with the Golden Delicious. So now let's move on to the last one, which is the Fuji. And I'm not really looking forward to this, considering that I didn't really like the apples themselves, but we'll see how it is. So yeah, that one doesn't taste very good. Somehow it manages to taste even worse than the actual apple itself. But yeah, there's really no but. It's just not a good applesauce. I wouldn't recommend making it with Fuji. I did notice as I was cooking it that this one took a little bit longer to break down, and I couldn't even get it to really fully break down in the same way that the others did. So there might be something with the texture of Fuji apples as well that just doesn't translate quite too well into an applesauce. Now, I don't mean to be too hard on Fuji apples in this video. I mean, I'm sure if you got a good batch of them, they would taste okay on their own. I just don't think that they're great for applesauce, or probably most other cooked applications for that matter. So again, among these four, I think the best option for anyone is gonna be some combination of Granny Smith, along with any other type of apple that you just like on its own. So for me, I really like Honeycrisp apples, so this combination between the Granny Smith and the Honeycrisp is perfect for me. But like I said, I also don't think you can go wrong with Golden Delicious, and I think that if you combine some Granny Smith with some Golden Delicious, it would be a pretty good combination. The main thing that I found though is the applesauce does benefit a lot from the acidity of the Granny Smith, and it kind of even helps to bring out the flavors of the other types of apples that you combine it with. So tasting them all again, I think the perfect combination for me would be about 75% Granny Smith, 25% Honeycrisp. But if you don't like too much acidity, I would just try the 50-50 or even 25% Granny Smith and 75% Honeycrisp. Now, if you really just don't want much acidity and you like a really sweet applesauce without having to add too much extra sugar, the Honeycrisp on its own is still a great option. And I wouldn't really recommend the pure Granny Smith version unless you just really like a ton of acidity. Or again, like I said earlier, I think it could benefit from some extra sugar and maybe even some butter to make sort of a less healthy dessert applesauce. And if you want to see some more ways that I like to use apples while they're in season, be sure to check out my apple turnover video in the bottom right corner of the screen.